The trading post fell silent when Marcus Ironheart walked through the door. At 8 feet tall, with shoulders that could block out the sun and hands the size of dinner plates, he was a mountain of a man who made grown trappers step aside and children hide behind their mothers' skirts. His face bore the scars of 100 battles. His eyes held the coldness of winter storms, and when he spoke, his voice rumbled like distant thunder across the Dakota plains. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But on this particular autumn morning in 1887, something impossible happened. A woman barely 5 feet tall, wearing a faded black dress and carrying a worn leather satchel, walked right up to this giant of the Lakota Nation, reached out her small, weathered hand, and without saying a word, took his massive fingers in hers. What happened next would change everything anyone thought they knew about fear, about strength, and about the power of the human heart. The story begins 3 years earlier, in the winter of 1884, when Marcus Ironheart was still known by his Lakota name, motto Waist Iron Bear. He stood as the most feared warrior of the Oglala band, a man whose very presence could end conflicts before they began. Children of rival tribes would be told stories of the giant who could split trees with his bare hands, and whose war cry could be heard for miles across the prairie. But Marcus hadn't always been a figure of terror, born during the harsh winter of 1855 to a respected medicine man named Joseph Crawfeather and his wife Sarah. Marcus came into the world already larger than most toddlers. The midwife, an elderly woman named Ruth Littlecloud, had delivered hundreds of babies in her 70 years, but she had never seen anything like this child. When Marcus drew his first breath, his cry was so loud it woke every dog in the village and sent the horses stampeding. As Marcus grew, so did the legends surrounding him. By age 5, he was taller than boys twice his age. By 10, he could lift stones that grown men struggled with. By 15, he stood nearly 7 feet tall and had already earned his adult name in battle against Crow raiding party that had threatened their winter camp. The transformation from gentle giant to fearsome warrior began with tragedy, as these stories often do. In the spring of 1872, when Marcus was 17, a group of cavalry soldiers arrived at their camp under the pretense of peaceful negotiations. Captain William Harrison, a man with cold blue eyes and a cruel smile, had come to discuss the boundaries of the reservation. Marcus's father, ever the diplomat, welcomed the soldiers with traditional hospitality, offering them food and shelter. It was a mistake that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. During the night, while the camp slept, Captain Harrison and his men attacked. They set fire to the tipis, shot anyone who tried to escape, and in the chaos that followed, Marcus watched helplessly as his parents and younger sister were gunned down in front of him. His father's last words, spoken in a whisper as he lay dying, were a plea for his son to protect their people. Something died in Marcus that night, and something else was born, something darker, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. The young man who had once helped elderly women gather berries and taught children how to track deer became a force of pure vengeance. He led retaliatory raids against army outposts, fought with such ferocity that soldiers told stories of the Iron Mountain, who seemed immune to bullets and could kill a man with his bare hands. His reputation grew with each battle, each victory, until his name was whispered in fear from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. Marcus became exactly what Captain Harrison and men like him had always claimed the Lakota were: savage, dangerous, and utterly without mercy. For 12 years, he lived this way, leading a band of warriors who followed him not out of love, but out of terror and respect for his strength. He took what he needed, struck fear into anyone who crossed his path, and built walls around his heart so high that no emotion could scale them. The trading posts in frontier towns knew to prepare for trouble. When word came that Ironheart was approaching, Shopkeepers would close their stores, families would lock their doors, and even the local sheriffs would find urgent business elsewhere. He wasn't just physically imposing. He was a man who had learned to weaponize his pain, turning grief into rage and rage into a reputation that preceded him like a storm front. But reputation, as Marcus would learn, is a double-edged weapon. The more feared he became, the more isolated he grew. Warriors might follow him, but they never truly knew him. Women might lie with him, but they never stayed. Children would never approach him with the innocent trust he remembered from his own youth. By the autumn of 1887, Marcus Ironheart had become exactly what he had set out to be, the most feared man in the Dakota Territory. He had wealth from his raids, power from his reputation, and respect born of terror. He had everything a warrior could want, except for the one thing he had lost that night, when his family died. He had forgotten how to be human. This was the man who walked into Thompson's trading post on that crisp October morning, expecting the usual deference, the usual fear, the usual wide berth that people gave him wherever he went. The trading post itself was typical of the frontier, establishments that dotted the landscape between civilized towns and wilderness, a sturdy log building with shelves lined with goods that settlers, trappers, and tribal members all needed. Flour, sugar, ammunition, blankets, tools, and whiskey competed for space with furs, beadwork, and other items brought for trade. Thomas Thompson, the proprietor, was a fair man who had built his business on treating all customers with equal respect, regardless of their background. His establishment had become neutral ground where Lakota, Crow, settlers, and trappers could conduct business without the tensions that plagued other parts of the territory. But even Thompson felt his stomach tighten when he saw Marcus's massive silhouette fill the doorway. The morning had started like any other. A group of trappers were examining new steel traps, their voices creating a comfortable buzz of commerce. 2 Crow women were trading beadwork for fabric, their children playing quietly near the pot-bellied stove. An elderly German settler named Hans Mueller was carefully counting out coins for a bag of coffee beans, his arthritic fingers moving slowly but deliberately. Then Marcus walked in, and the world shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The children instinctively moved closer to their mothers. Even the big trappers, men who faced down grizzly bears for a living, suddenly found great interest in examining the floor planks. Marcus was used to this reaction. He moved through the store with deliberate slowness, his moccasined feet silent. Despite his enormous size, he needed supplies, jerky, ammunition, a new knife to replace the one he'd broken in his last encounter with a cavalry patrol. Simple transactions that should have taken minutes. But as he reached for a box of cartridges on a high shelf, something unprecedented happened. A small hand touched his arm. Marcus spun around, his hand instinctively moving to the tomahawk at his belt, expecting to find some foolish challenger, or perhaps a pickpocket bold enough to try their luck. Instead, he looked down into the face of a woman who barely reached his chest. She was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and skin weathered by sun and hardship. Her dress was black, marking her as a widow, and it had been carefully mended in several places. Her shoes were worn but clean, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who had faced loss, but had not been broken by it. What struck Marcus most, however, were her eyes. They were the color of spring sky, clear and bright, and they held no fear, none whatsoever. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Could you help me reach that sewing kit on the top shelf? I'm afraid it's a bit high for me." The entire trading post held its breath. Even Thompson stopped counting change, certain he was about to witness violence. Everyone knew what happened to people who dared to make demands of Marcus Ironheart. Marcus stared down at this tiny woman, who had just done something no one had dared to do in over a decade, treat him like an ordinary person. His first instinct was anger. How dare she? Didn't she know who he was? Hadn't she heard the stories? But something in her expression stopped him. She wasn't challenging him or testing him. She wasn't even particularly impressed by his size. She had simply asked for help, the way one human being asks another for a small favor. Without a word, Marcus reached up and retrieved the sewing kit, his massive hand making the small wooden box look like a child's toy. As he handed it to her, their fingers touched briefly, and for just a moment, something shifted in the carefully constructed arm around his heart. "Thank you kindly," she said, offering him a genuine smile. "I'm Eleanor Whitman. I don't believe we've been introduced." The silence in the trading post stretched so long that the crackling of the fire in the stove sounded like gunshots. Marcus Ironheart, the terror of the plains, the man who had never been known to exchange pleasantries with anyone, found himself at a complete loss for words. Eleanor Whitman. The name meant nothing to him, but something about the way she said it, the simple normalcy of the introduction, created a crack in the walls he had built around himself. "Marcus," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. He almost added his tribal name, almost recited the list of his victories and conquests that usually served as his introduction. But something about her steady gaze made those boasts seem suddenly hollow. "Well, Marcus, it's very nice to meet you," Eleanor said, as if she were talking to any other customer in the store. "I hope you have a pleasant day." And with that, she turned to conduct her business with Thompson, leaving Marcus standing there like a mountain that had suddenly forgotten how to be immovable. The other customers gradually resumed their activities, but Marcus remained frozen, watching this small woman count out coins for thread and buttons with the same careful attention Hans Mueller had given to his coffee beans. There was something about her methodical movements, her quiet concentration, that fascinated him in a way he couldn't understand. When Eleanor finished her purchases and headed for the door, Marcus found himself following, not stalking or pursuing, but simply walking in the same direction, as if drawn by some invisible force he couldn't name. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Outside the trading post, Eleanor paused to arrange her purchases in her satchel. The fingy autumn air was crisp, filled with the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. Marcus emerged behind her, his shadow falling across her small frame like a dark cloud. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, surprising himself by using her name. She turned, showing no alarm at finding herself alone with the most dangerous man in the territory. "Yes?" Marcus opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He had no idea what he wanted to say. For a man who had learned to communicate primarily through violence and intimidation, the simple act of conversation had become foreign territory. "You're not afraid," he said finally, and it came out more like an accusation than an observation. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, considering the statement. Should I be? The question caught him off guard. Should she be? Logic said yes. Every story told about him, every reputation he had carefully cultivated, suggested that any rational person should be terrified in his presence. "Most people are," he said. "Most people haven't buried a husband and 3 children," Eleanor replied, her voice matter-of-fact rather than self-pitying. "After you've held your youngest while she died of fever, after you've watched consumption, take your husband piece by piece over 2 years, after you've stood at gravesides and thrown dirt on the faces of everyone you loved most in this world, well, it changes your perspective on what's truly frightening." Her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was someone who understood loss, who had faced the kind of pain that reshapes a person's very soul. But instead of becoming a force of destruction like he had, she seemed to have found some kind of peace. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt strange in his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he had expressed sympathy to anyone. "Thank you," Eleanor said simply. But my point is that grief teaches you to recognize pain in others. And you, Marcus, are carrying more pain than anyone should have to bear alone." The observation was so unexpected, so gently delivered, that Marcus felt as if she had reached right through his chest and touched something he had thought was dead and buried. No one had seen past his reputation in years. No one had looked at the feared warrior and seen the broken young man underneath. "You don't know anything about me," he said, but there was no anger in it, just a kind of desperate confusion. "I know enough," Eleanor said. "I know that people don't become what you've become without losing everything that mattered to them first. I know that the bigger the man, the deeper the hurt usually goes. And I know that no one chooses to live so alone unless they've been given reasons to believe they don't deserve anything else." Marcus stared at her, this tiny woman who had just dismantled his entire carefully constructed identity with a few quiet observations. She spoke with the certainty of someone who had walked through her own darkness and emerged on the other side. "Why? Aren't you afraid?" he asked again, but this time the question was different, less challenge, more genuine curiosity. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, looking past him toward the distant mountains where the early snow was already dusting the peaks. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Because I've learned that the people who try hardest to look dangerous are usually the ones who are most afraid themselves. Because I've discovered that sometimes the scariest looking folks are just people who have forgotten they deserve kindness. And because," she paused, meeting his eyes directly, "I believe that everyone deserves a chance to remember who they were before the world broke them." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge Marcus didn't know how to cross. For 12 years, he had defined himself by his capacity for violence, by his ability to inspire fear, by his reputation as a man who showed no mercy and expected none in return. But here was someone offering him something he had forgotten existed: simple, human compassion, given freely without expectation of anything in return. "I should go," Eleanor said, adjusting her satchel strap. "I have a long walk ahead of me." "Where?" The question escaped before Marcus could stop it. "Home," she said. "About 5 miles north of here. I have a small cabin by Willow Creek. It's not much, but it's peaceful." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched her begin to walk away, this small figure in black who had somehow managed to shake the very foundations of who he thought he was. But Eleanor had only taken a few steps when she turned back. "Marcus," she said, "if you ever find yourself tired of carrying all that weight alone, you're welcome to stop by for coffee. I make a decent pot, and sometimes it helps to have someone to sit with who understands what it means to lose everything." She didn't wait for an answer. She simply turned and walked away, her small figure gradually disappearing down the dirt road that led north toward the creek. But her words echoed in Marcus's mind long after she had vanished from sight. For the first time in 12 years, Marcus Ironheart found himself wondering what it might be like to be just Marcus again. The next several weeks passed strangely for the giant warrior. He continued his usual patterns, leading his band of followers on raids against army supply trains, taking what they needed from settlements that had grown fat on land that had once belonged to his people, inspiring the same fear and respect he had cultivated for over a decade. But something had changed in the fundamental way he moved through the world. Where once he had taken satisfaction in the terror he inspired, now he found himself noticing the faces of the people who scattered before him. He saw mothers clutching their children, shopkeepers whose hands shook as they handed over goods, men who tried to make themselves invisible in his presence. For the first time, he wondered what his own father would think of the man he had become. Joseph Crowfeather had been a healer, a man who brought peace rather than conflict, who solved problems with wisdom rather than violence. Marcus remembered sitting at his father's feet as a child, listening to stories about the importance of balance, about how true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary and when. It was simply cruelty disguised as justice. The memory made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite define. His band of followers began to notice the change, though they couldn't identify exactly what was different. Marcus still led them with the same tactical brilliance, still struck fear into their enemies, still provided for them through his strength and cunning. But there was something distant about him now, as if part of his attention was always elsewhere. David, Strong Wolf, his lieutenant and closest thing to a friend, finally confronted him about it during a cold evening in late October. "You've been different since that day at Thompson's," David said as they sat around their campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "Distracted. What happened there?" Marcus stared into the fire, remembering a pair of sky blue eyes and a voice that had spoken to him without fear. "Nothing happened." "Nothing doesn't make a man question everything he's built for 12 years, David pressed. "Was it Harrison? Did someone bring word about him?" "Captain Harrison." The name still had the power to make Marcus's jaw clench and his hands curl into fists. The man responsible for destroying his family had been promoted twice since that night in 1872 and now commanded the entire regional cavalry. He had never faced justice for what he had done, never even been questioned about the massacre he had orchestrated. "It wasn't Harrison," Marcus said. David waited, knowing his leader well enough to recognize when pushing would only result in silence. Around them, the other warriors settled in for the night, their weapons within easy reach, their sleep always light and ready for trouble. "There was a woman," Marcus said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth. David raised an eyebrow. Marcus was known for his complete disinterest in romantic entanglements. He had always claimed that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that would compromise his effectiveness as a leader and warrior. What kind of woman makes Marcus Ironheart forget how to think straight? David asked with a slight grin, but Marcus wasn't smiling. "The kind who looks at you and sees through everything you've built around yourself. The kind who treats you like you're still human when you've spent years proving you're not." The honesty in his voice made David's grin fade. He had known Marcus since they were both boys, had watched him transform from the gentle giant everyone loved into the feared warrior. Everyone respected, but no one truly knew. He had seen his friend build walls so high and so thick that David sometimes wondered if the man he had grown up with still existed somewhere inside them. "What did she say to you?" David asked quietly. Marcus was silent for so long that David thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She said I deserved kindness." The words hung in the air like smoke from the fire, carrying weight that seemed disproportionate to their simplicity. But David understood. He knew that Marcus hadn't received genuine kindness from anyone in years. Respect, yes. Fear, absolutely. Even a form of love from the warriors who followed him. But not kindness, not the simple, uncomplicated compassion that one human being offers to another without expectation of return. "Maybe she's right," David said carefully. Marcus turned to look at his friend, studying his face in the firelight. "You think I deserve kindness? After everything I've done?" It was a question that went to the heart of something Marcus had been struggling with since that morning at the trading post. He had built his identity around being something more than human, stronger, harder, more dangerous. But Eleanor Whitman had seen him as simply a man carrying too much pain, and somehow that recognition had made him feel more vulnerable than any weapon ever had. "I think," David said slowly, "that the man who used to carry wounded birds back to their nests and share his food with anyone who was hungry probably still exists somewhere inside the warrior you became. And I think that man always deserved kindness, even when he forgot how to accept it." The conversation died there, but its echoes would resonate through Marcus's thoughts for days to come. He found himself remembering things he had deliberately forgotten, the way his mother used to sing while she worked, how his father would place a gentle hand on his shoulder when offering guidance, the trust in his sister's eyes when she would ask him to tell her stories. He also found himself thinking about Eleanor Whitman's cabin by Willow Creek, wondering what it looked like, wondering if she really did make decent coffee, wondering what it might be like to sit somewhere peaceful with someone who didn't expect him to be anything other than himself. The wandering became a constant companion, following him through his daily routines like a quiet shadow. When he led raids, he thought about her observation that people who looked dangerous were often the most afraid. When he collected tribute from frightened settlers, he wondered what she would think of the fear in their eyes. When he sat alone at night, listening to the wind across the plains, he found himself imagining what it might be like to have someone to talk to who understood loss without trying to fix it, or exploit it. That the transformation was subtle but persistent. Marcus began to notice things he had trained himself to ignore, the way children looked at him with genuine terror, the relief in people's voices when he left them alive, the loneliness that had become so constant he had stopped recognizing it as anything unusual. 3 weeks after their encounter at the trading post, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. He was going to accept Eleanor Whitman's invitation. The decision haunted Marcus for 3 more days before he finally acted on it. On a gray November morning, when frost painted the grass silver and his breath formed clouds in the cold air, he found himself riding north toward Willow Creek, alone for the first time in years. He had left his band camped in a valley 10 miles south, telling David only that he had business to attend to. The lie sat uneasily with him. He and David had never hidden things from each other. But how could he explain something he didn't understand himself? How could he tell his lieutenant that the most feared warrior in the Dakota Territory was riding to have coffee with a widow because she had offered him kindness? The landscape between the trading post and Willow Creek rolled gently under gray skies, covered with the kind of prairie grass that whispered secrets when the wind moved through it. Marcus had ridden this territory countless times during raids and scouting missions, but today he noticed details that had escaped him before: the way oak trees clustered near water sources, how deer trails cut efficient paths through the rougher terrain, the particular quality of light that made everything look both stark and beautiful in late autumn. His horse, a massive black stallion named Thunder, that was one of the few creatures that could carry his weight comfortably, seemed to sense his rider's unusual mood. The animal moved with less of his typical warhorse alertness, settling into a steady pace that suggested a journey rather than a mission. As they crested a low hill, Marcus saw the thin line of trees that marked Willow Creek's path across the prairie. His pulse quickened involuntarily, and he found himself checking his appearance in a way that would have amused his warriors. He had braided his long black hair with more care than usual, chosen his best buckskin shirt, and even cleaned the silver armband that had been his father's. Not that he was trying to impress anyone, he told himself. He simply believed in showing respect. The creek came into view first, a ribbon of dark water bordered by the drooping branches of the trees that gave it its name. Then, set back perhaps 50 yards from the water on a small rise, he saw Eleanor's cabin. It was smaller than he had expected, a single-room log structure with a stone chimney from which a thin stream of smoke was rising. A modest garden plot, now brown with winter's approach, occupied the space between the cabin and the creek. Clothes hung on a line stretched between 2 posts, and a small barn housed what looked like a milk cow and a few chickens. It was the most peaceful place Marcus had seen in years. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain. What was the protocol here? In his world, visits were either social calls between equals or displays of power between enemies. This felt like neither and both at once. Before he could decide how to announce himself, the cabin door opened and Eleanor emerged, carrying a basket of laundry. She spotted him immediately, but showed no surprise, as if giant warriors appeared in her yard every day. "Marcus," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the open space. "I wondered if you might stop by eventually. Let me just hang these shirts and I'll put the coffee on." Her casualness both relieved and unnerved him. He had prepared himself for various reactions: fear, suspicion, curiosity, but not this matter-of-fact welcome. He tied Thunder to a fence post and walked slowly toward the cabin, hyper-aware of how his footsteps sounded on the frozen ground, how his shadow fell across Eleanor's neat little world like a storm cloud. "You have a beautiful place," he said, and meant it. There was something about the careful arrangement of everything, the way the garden was laid out, the precise spacing of the fence posts, the way the woodpile was stacked to shed water, that spoke of someone who found peace and order and purpose in small daily tasks. "Thank you," Eleanor said, pinning a flannel shirt to the line with practiced efficiency. "It's not much, but it's mine. After William died, that was my husband, I could have moved back east to live with my sister. But I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this place. We built it together, you see. Every log, every stone, it holds too many good memories to abandon." She spoke about her loss matter-of-factly, the way someone might mention the weather. Marcus realized this was how she had learned to carry her grief, not by hiding from it, but by integrating it into the fabric of her daily existence. "How long has it been?" he asked. 3 years this Christmas," Eleanor replied, moving to the next item in her basket. "The children went first. Scarlet fever took them in the span of 2 weeks. William lasted until the following spring, but I think he died of heartbreak as much as the consumption. Sometimes I wonder if I should have gone with them, but then I remember that someone needs to tend the graves, keep the cabin from falling down, feed the chickens. Life has a way of insisting on itself, even when you're not particularly interested in living it." Her honesty was like a physical force, cutting through the careful emotional armor Marcus had worn for so long. He found himself speaking without conscious decision. "My family was murdered when I was 17. My parents, my sister. Soldiers came in the night." Eleanor paused in her work, a wet sock in her hands, and looked at him directly. "I'm sorry. That's a terrible thing for anyone to carry, especially someone so young. I've spent the last 12 years making sure the people responsible pay for what they did. And has it helped? Revenge?" The question caught him off guard because no one had ever asked it before. His band assumed his quest for vengeance was righteous and necessary. His enemies simply tried to avoid becoming targets. But had it helped? "I don't know," he said, surprised by his own honesty. "For a while, it felt like purpose. Like I was honoring their memory by making sure their deaths meant something. But lately it just feels empty," Eleanor finished for him, hanging the sock next to the shirt. "That's because revenge is like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. It seems like it should help, but it only makes you need more." She finished with the laundry and turned to face him fully. "Come inside. That coffee isn't going to make itself, and you look like you could use something warm." The interior of Eleanor's cabin was a revelation. Despite its small size, perhaps 12 feet by 16 feet, it felt spacious and comfortable. The walls were lined with shelves holding books, dishes, and small treasures. A large bed occupied one corner, neatly made with a colorful quilt. A table and 2 chairs sat near the single window, which looked out over the creek. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking grate and a coffee pot hanging from an iron hook. What struck Marcus most was how lived in everything felt. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a home. Every object seemed to have a story, a purpose, a place in the daily rhythm of Eleanor's life. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Eleanor said, moving to prepare the coffee. "Though I'm afraid the chairs might be a bit small for you. William was a big man, but not quite your size." Marcus lowered himself carefully onto one of the wooden chairs, which creaked ominously under his weight, but held. From this vantage point, he could see the personal touches that made the cabin special: a pressed flower under glass on the windowsill, A collection of smooth stones arranged on the mantel. A half-finished piece of embroidery folded neatly on the table. "You live alone here?" he asked. "Most of the time," Eleanor replied, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "I have neighbors about 3 miles east, the Morrison family. Good people. They check on me regularly, help with the heavier work around the place. And Thompson from the trading post stops by when he's traveling this way. But yes, mostly it's just me and the animals. Aren't you afraid? A woman alone out here?" Eleanor added water to the coffee pot and hung it over the fire before turning to look at him. "Of what? Wild animals? I've learned to coexist with them. Bandits? I don't have anything worth stealing except the livestock and anyone who wants. A cranky old cow and some scrawny chickens badly enough to ride all the way out here is welcome to them. Indians?" She smiled slightly. "Well, the most dangerous one I know is sitting at my table drinking my coffee." The comment should have stung, but something in her tone made it feel almost affectionate, the way someone might tease a friend about. "A harmless quirk. You're not what I expected," Marcus said. "What did you expect?" He considered the question seriously. "Someone more fragile, I suppose. Someone who would see me as either a threat to be feared or a problem to be solved. Most people want something from me, my protection, my absence, my death. You seem to just want my company." Eleanor settled into the chair across from him, her movements economical and graceful. "I spent 2 years watching my husband die by inches. I held my children as fever burned them up from the inside. I've buried everyone I loved most in this world with my own hands. After experiences like that, you develop different ideas about what's genuinely frightening and what's just complicated." The coffee began to bubble, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dried leaves skittering across the yard. The sound emphasized the warmth and shelter of the small space they shared. "Tell me about them," Eleanor said suddenly. "Your family. What were they like before you lost them?" The request startled Marcus. In 12 years of talking about his family's death, no one had ever asked about their lives. Everyone focused on the tragedy, the injustice, the need for vengeance. But Eleanor wanted to know about the people themselves. "My father was a medicine man," Marcus began slowly. "Joseph Crowfeather. He could set bones, treat fevers, help women in childbirth, but mostly he was a peacemaker. When there were disputes between families or disagreements about hunting grounds, people would come to him for wisdom. He had this way of listening that made you feel like your problems mattered, like he truly understood what you were going through." Eleanor nodded encouragingly, rising to check the coffee. "My mother, Sarah, was the best storyteller in our band. In the evenings, after the work was done, people would gather around our fire to hear her tell the old stories about coyotes, tricks, about how the world was made, about the heroes of our people. She could make you laugh or cry or sit on the edge of your seat, all with just her voice and her gestures." "And your sister?" Marcus smiled for the first time in the conversation. "Little Moon. She was 7 when she died, but she was going to be a healer like our father. She was always bringing home injured creatures, birds with broken wings, rabbits that had been caught by foxes but escaped, once even a bear cub whose mother had been killed by hunters. She had this absolute faith that anything could be fixed, if you just cared enough." Eleanor poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one in front of Marcus. The liquid was dark and strong, with a slight bite that warmed him from the inside. "They sound like wonderful people," she said. "The kind who made the world a little better just by being in it." "They were," Marcus said, cradling the cup in his massive hands. "I used to think that was weakness, all that kindness, that desire to heal instead of hurt. After they died, I decided that if they had been harder, stronger, more willing to fight, they might still be alive. And now?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers. Now I wonder if I dishonored their memory by becoming everything they would have opposed. My father spent his life bringing peace, and I've spent mine bringing war. My mother taught people to see the best in each other, and I've made them see only the worst in me. My sister believed anything could be healed, and I've become something that causes wounds instead of treating them. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying his face. What do you think they would say if they could see you now? The question hit like a physical blow. Marcus had spent 12 years carefully avoiding that exact thought, but Eleanor's gentle directness made evasion impossible. I think they would be heartbroken, he said quietly. Not angry, they were never the type to hold anger, but heartbroken to see what their son became. And what do you think they would want for you now? Marcus looked up from his coffee to meet her eyes. I think they would want me to find my way back to who I was before. But I don't know if that person still exists. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her small hand over his much larger one. The contact was brief, light, but it sent a shock through Marcus's entire system. When was the last time someone had touched him with gentleness rather than fear or desire? He exists, she said with quiet certainty. I can see him right now, sitting at my table, remembering people he loved instead of enemies he's conquered. The question is whether you're brave enough to let him out. Brave enough? Marcus almost laughed at the irony. I've never been accused of cowardice. Physical courage is easy compared to emotional courage, Eleanor replied. It takes no bravery at all to continue being something that brings you no joy, serves no real purpose, and isolates you from every meaningful connection you might have. The brave thing would be to risk becoming someone different, someone who might be rejected or misunderstood or seen as weak. She rose to refill their coffee cups, moving around the small space with familiar efficiency. Marcus watched her, noting the way she moved without wasted motion, how she seemed completely at peace with her solitary existence. How do you do it? He asked. Live alone like this? Find contentment after losing everything? Eleanor settled back into her chair, considering the question. I suppose it starts with accepting that loss is part of life, not a deviation from it. We spend so much energy trying to prevent losing the things we love that we forget to fully enjoy having them. After William and the children died, I had a choice. I could spend my remaining years mourning what was gone, or I could honor their memory by learning to find meaning in what remained. What remained? The sunrise over the creek every morning, the satisfaction of growing my own food, the pleasure of a good book on a cold evening, the friendship of neighbors who care about my welfare. Small things maybe, but they add up too. Something larger if you pay attention to them. Marcus sipped his coffee, trying to imagine what that kind of contentment would feel like. For 12 years, his existence had been defined by grand gestures, raids that would be talked about for years, displays of strength that enhanced his reputation, acts of vengeance that felt significant in the moment but left him empty afterward. I don't know how to live small, he admitted. Then maybe start medium, Eleanor suggested with a slight smile. You don't have to transform your entire existence overnight, but you could begin by asking yourself what would happen if you chose kindness over intimidation, just once. What would it feel like to help someone instead of threatening them? What would change if you allowed yourself to be seen as human instead of as a force of nature? The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. Marcus was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his weapons, his body positioning itself between Eleanor and the door. But Eleanor seemed unconcerned, moving to the window to peer out. It's young Jimmy Morrison, she said. He's riding like the devil himself is after him. The hoofbeats stopped just outside, followed immediately by frantic knocking on the door. Mrs. Whitman, are you there? We need help. Eleanor opened the door to reveal a boy of perhaps 14, red-faced and breathing hard from his desperate ride. His eyes widened when he saw Marcus looming behind Eleanor, but desperation overcame fear. "It's my pa," the boy gasped. He was cutting timber and a tree fell on him. "We can't move it, and he's bleeding something awful. Ma sent me to fetch you because you're the closest thing we have to a doctor around here. But I don't know what good you can do against something this heavy." "And slow down, Jimmy," Eleanor said calmly. "How far is he trapped? Can you see the injuries?" "The trees got him pinned across the chest and right arm. He's conscious but in terrible pain. Ma and my sister are with him, but they can't budge that log. It's got to weigh more than a horse." Eleanor turned to look at Marcus, and he saw the calculation in her eyes. Here was a situation that required both her medical knowledge and his physical strength. "I'll get my supplies," she said. "Marcus, if you're willing to help, we could save a man's life today." Marcus looked at the frightened boy, thought about a family facing the loss of their father and husband, and made a decision that would have shocked his warriors. "Get your things," he said. "I'll bring Thunder around." The ride to the Morrison homestead took 20 minutes across rough terrain, with Eleanor riding behind Marcus on Thunder and young Jimmy leading the way on his tired horse. Eleanor had strapped her medical supplies to her waist and shouted instructions to Marcus over the wind about what they would likely face. The Morrison place was typical of frontier homesteads, a modest cabin surrounded by partially cleared land, where stumps stood like broken teeth among the growing crops. Behind the house, Marcus could see the disaster site, a massive oak tree, easily 3 feet in diameter, lying across a man who was writhing in obvious agony while 2 women tried desperately to comfort him. Marcus took in the situation at a glance. The tree was too heavy for any normal group of people to move, and its position meant that trying to cut it up while it lay on the injured man would likely cause more damage. But if someone could lift the trunk just enough... "Can you raise it?" Eleanor asked, already moving toward her patient with her medical bag. Marcus studied the angle, the weight distribution, the leverage points. "Maybe, but only for a few minutes, and you'll have to work fast." The injured man, Robert Morrison, was conscious but clearly in shock. His wife, a worn-looking woman in her 40s, held his hand while his teenage daughter tried to apply pressure to a bleeding wound on his forehead. "This is Marcus," Eleanor announced as she knelt beside Robert. "He's going to lift the tree so I can examine you properly. Robert, I need you to stay as still as possible when he does." Robert Morrison's eyes widened when he saw Marcus. Everyone in the territory knew who he was, but pain overrode fear. "Do... whatever you have to do," he gasped. Marcus positioned himself at the optimal point on the fallen tree, braced his legs, and lifted. The massive trunk rose slowly, groaning with the redistribution of weight. His muscles strained against the enormous mass, veins standing out on his neck and arms as he fought against gravity and physics. Eleanor worked with swift efficiency, her hands exploring Robert's chest and arm while the tree was suspended. 2 broken ribs, but they haven't punctured anything vital. The arm is definitely broken, but the bones aren't displaced badly. Most of this blood is from the head wound. Scalp injuries always look worse than they are. Can single quotes hold it ... Much longer, Marcus grunted through clenched teeth. "Just 30 more seconds, Eleanor said, wrapping Robert's head wound with quick, sure movements. "There, set it down easy." Marcus lowered the tree carefully, his entire body shaking from the exertion. But Robert Morrison was free and very much alive. Over the next hour, Eleanor worked to set the broken arm and bind the injured ribs while Marcus helped by holding the patient steady and fetching supplies. The Morrison family watched this unlikely partnership with amazement, the territory's most feared warrior taking gentle direction from a small widow. Both of them focused entirely on saving a man's life. When Eleanor finally declared her work complete, Robert was sitting up against a fence post, his arm in a proper sling and his ribs tightly bound. He would recover fully, though it would take time. "I don't know how to thank you both," Mrs. Morrison said, tears streaming down her face. If you hadn't come when you did ... Just take care of him, Eleanor replied. Keep those ribs bound for at least 6 weeks, change the head bandage daily, and send for me if there's any sign of infection. As they prepared to leave, Robert Morrison called out to Marcus, Mr. Ironheart, sir, I know ... I know your reputation. But what you did today ... that was the act of a good man. Whatever people say about you, I'll always remember that you saved my life. The words followed Marcus as he and Eleanor rode back toward her cabin in the gathering dusk. He had lifted that tree without thinking, acted on pure instinct to help someone in need. And for the first time in 12 years, he had been seen not as a feared warrior or a dangerous enemy, but as simply a man who had done the right thing. That was well done, Eleanor said as they approached her homestead. It felt ... Marcus searched for the right word. Different. Good different. Eleanor smiled, though he couldn't see it in the growing darkness. That's what happens when you let yourself be who you really are, instead of who you think you have to be. As Marcus prepared to leave, Eleanor made an invitation that would change everything. Marcus, would you consider staying for supper? I was planning to make stew, and there's certainly enough for 2. Unless you need to get back to your men tonight. Marcus looked toward the south, where his band was camped, then back at Eleanor's cabin with its warm light spilling from the windows. I'd like that, he said, surprising himself again. I'd like that very much. The stew Eleanor prepared that evening was the best meal Marcus had eaten in years. Not because the ingredients were particularly exotic, just venison, potatoes, carrots, and herbs from her garden, but because of the care with which it was prepared and the company with which it was shared. They ate by lamplight at her small table, talking about everything except the things that usually defined their lives. Eleanor told him about her attempts to grow tomatoes in the harsh Dakota climate, about the fox family that denned near her woodpile each spring, about the book of poetry she was slowly working her way through for the 3rd time. Marcus found himself sharing memories he hadn't spoken aloud in years, the way his mother would sing while preparing meals, how his father had taught him to read tracks in snow, the elaborate games of hide and seek he used to play with little Moon among the cottonwoods by their camp. It was nearly midnight when Marcus finally prepared to leave, and the reluctance he felt surprised him. When was the last time he had simply enjoyed another person's company without agenda, without the need to maintain his reputation or assert his dominance? Thank you, he said as Eleanor walked him to where Thunder waited patiently. For the meal, the conversation, the ... normalcy. You're welcome any time, Eleanor replied, and he could hear in her voice that she meant it. The door is always open, Marcus. Remember that. The ride back to his camp gave Marcus time to think, and what he discovered disturbed him. The evening with Eleanor had reminded him of something he had forgotten existed, the possibility of simple contentment. For a few hours, he had been neither the feared Marcus Ironheart nor the grieving son seeking vengeance. He had just been a man sharing a meal with a friend, and the experience had felt more real than anything in his life for over a decade. But as he approached the glow of his band's campfire, reality reasserted itself. These were his responsibilities, 23 warriors who followed him, depended on him, looked to him for leadership and protection. He couldn't simply abandon them to pursue some fantasy of domestic peace. David Strongwolf was waiting for him, as Marcus had known he would be. Long meeting, David observed, noting the lateness of the hour. It was, Marcus replied, unsaddling Thunder and checking the horse's legs for any signs of strain from carrying double weight earlier. Learn anything useful? Marcus paused in his work, considering the question. Had he learned anything useful? He had learned that kindness felt better than intimidation, that helping someone heal was more satisfying than causing injury. That's simple. Human connection could fill spaces in his soul he hadn't even realized were empty. Maybe, he said finally. David studied his friend's face in the firelight. This woman, she's important to you. It wasn't a question, and Marcus didn't treat it as one. She sees me differently than most people do. How? Like I'm still human. The honesty of the admission hung between them. David had known Marcus longer than anyone else alive, had watched him build the walls that protected him from further loss. If anyone could understand the significance of those walls being breached, it was David. That could be dangerous, David said carefully. For both of you. Marcus knew what his friend meant. A man in his position couldn't afford vulnerability. Too many people depended on his strength, his decisiveness, his willingness to do what others couldn't or wouldn't do. And Eleanor associating with him put her at risk from his enemies, from people who might try to use her against him. I know, Marcus said, but I can't seem to stay away. Over the following weeks, that statement proved prophetic. Marcus found himself riding to Eleanor's cabin every few days, always with some excuse. He needed to check on Robert Morrison's recovery. He wanted to repay her kindness with fresh game. He was simply passing through the area. Eleanor never questioned his reasons, simply welcomed him with the same matter-of-fact warmth she had shown from the beginning. During these visits, Marcus began to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried for years. Eleanor had a way of asking questions that made him examine his assumptions, his motivations, his choices. She never lectured or judged, but her gentle probing helped him see his life from angles he had never considered. Do your men follow you out of loyalty or fear? She asked one afternoon as they walked along Willow Creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones. Marcus considered the question seriously. Both, I suppose. They respect my strength, my tactical abilities. They know I'll protect them and lead them to victory. But they also know what happens to people who cross me. And which do you think makes for better followers? Fear is more reliable, Marcus said automatically, then paused. At least that's what I always believed. Loyalty can be fickle, can change based on circumstances. Fear is constant. Eleanor picked up a flat stone and skipped it across a calm section of creek. My husband used to say that anything built on fear will eventually crumble, because fear requires constant reinforcement. Love and respect, on the other hand, tend to grow stronger over time if they're nurtured properly. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man. He was. He also said that the strongest leaders are the ones people choose to follow, not the ones they're forced to obey. Marcus watched her skip another stone, noting the easy grace of the motion. You're suggesting I've been leading wrong. I'm not suggesting anything, Eleanor said with a slight smile. I'm just sharing what a good man once told me about the difference between power and leadership. These conversations stayed with Marcus long after he returned to his band. He began to notice things about his followers that he had previously ignored. The way they tensed when he approached, how they were quick to agree with his suggestions, even when he could see doubt in their eyes, the careful distance they maintained. Unless he specifically called them closer, fear might be reliable, but it was also isolating. The realization crystallized during a raid on an army supply convoy in mid-December. The operation went perfectly. They intercepted the wagons at a narrow pass, overwhelmed the guards quickly and efficiently, and made off with enough ammunition and supplies to last through the winter. But as Marcus watched his men celebrate their victory, he felt none of the satisfaction that such successes usually brought him. Instead, he found himself thinking about the terror in the young soldiers' eyes as they surrendered, the way they had flinched when he approached to accept their weapons. These were boys, really, probably no older than he had been when his family was murdered. They were following orders, doing what they believed was right, just as he was doing what he believed was necessary. When had the distinction between justice and cruelty become so blurred? You're thinking too much again, David said, settling beside Marcus as the celebration continued around them. Maybe I haven't been thinking enough, Marcus replied. David followed his gaze to where the captured soldiers sat under guard, young faces pale with fear and cold. They'll be released unharmed. As always, you're not a killer of innocents, Marcus. You never have been. But I'm not a protector of them either. When did that change? When did I stop caring whether my actions helped my people and start caring only whether they hurt my enemies? The question troubled David because he didn't have a good answer. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that none of them had noticed it happening. Somewhere along the way, their mission had shifted from protecting their families and preserving their way of life to simply striking back at anyone who represented the forces that had harmed them. What would you have us do instead? David asked. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that warmed them against the December cold. I don't know yet, but I'm starting to think there might be other ways to honor our dead than by creating more of them. Word of Marcus's changing perspective didn't take long to spread through the band. Warriors who had followed him for years began to whisper among themselves about their leader's frequent absences, his reluctance to pursue certain types of raids, his growing tendency to question tactics that had served them well for over a decade. Discontent came to a head 3 days before Christmas, when Marcus refused to authorize an attack on a settlement that housed several families with young children. It's a legitimate target, argued Robert Blackhorse, one of his more aggressive lieutenants. They're squatting on land that belonged to our grandfathers, taking water rights that should be ours, building their future on our people's graves. And attacking them will accomplish what exactly? Marcus asked. We'll drive off a few families, burn some cabins, steal some livestock. In a month, the army will send reinforcements and more settlers will take their place. Meanwhile, those children will grow up with stories about savage Indians who murdered their neighbors, and the cycle continues. Since when do you care about their children? Blackhorse shot back. Did they care about ours when they gave us blankets infected with smallpox? Did they care about our children when they herded us onto reservations with bad water and worse food? The challenge in Blackhorse's voice was unmistakable, and every warrior in the camp stopped what they were doing to watch how their leader would respond. In the old days, questioning Marcus Ironheart's judgment would have resulted in swift and decisive punishment, but Marcus felt only weariness. You're right, they didn't care about our children. So we become just like them. We prove that everything they said about us was true. We prove that there are consequences for stealing what isn't theirs, Blackhorse insisted. We prove that. We won't disappear quietly into the night. Or we prove that we're exactly the monsters they painted us as in the first place. The argument might have escalated, but David stepped forward with the diplomatic skills that had made him Marcus's most trusted lieutenant. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should take time to consider all our options. The settlement isn't going anywhere. We can watch it, learn its patterns, decide on the best course of action when we have better information. It was a compromise. That satisfied no one but prevented an immediate confrontation. Blackhorse stalked away, muttering under his breath about weak leadership. Several other warriors followed him, their body language making their loyalties clear. Marcus knew he was losing them. The question was whether he cared enough to fight to keep them. That night, he rode to Eleanor's cabin without even bothering to create an excuse. She took one look at his face and put coffee on without being asked. Trouble with your men? She asked as they settled at her table. They think I've gone soft. Maybe they're right. Eleanor studied his face in the lamplight. Have you? I don't. No. I used to be certain about everything, who my enemies were, what needed to be done, how to achieve my goals. Now I question every decision, second-guess every order. A leader who doubts himself isn't much use to anyone. Or maybe, Eleanor suggested, a leader who never doubts himself isn't much use to anyone either. Certainty can be just another word for stubbornness. Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. My men followed me because I was strong, decisive, uncompromising. If I'm not those things anymore, why should they stay? What do you want them to stay for? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? I mean, what do you want to offer them instead of fear and certainty? What kind of leader do you want to be if not the kind you've been? Marcus was quiet for a long time, thinking about the young soldiers they had captured, about Robert Morrison's gratitude, about the way Eleanor looked at him without any trace of intimidation or calculation. I want to be the kind of leader my father would have respected, he said finally. Someone who protects rather than punishes, who builds rather than destroys. Someone who gives his people something to hope for instead of just something to fight against. That's a worthy goal. But it's also a harder path than the one you've been walking. Why? Eleanor rose to refill their cups, her movements graceful and deliberate. Because fear is simple, but hope is complicated. It's easy to unite people against a common enemy, much harder to unite them toward a common dream. Destruction can be accomplished quickly, but building something meaningful takes time, patience, and a willingness to fail and try again. She settled back into her chair, her blue eyes serious. The question is whether you're prepared for that kind of challenge. Whether you're willing to risk everything you've built for the chance to become something better. And if my men won't follow me down that path, then you'll find out who your true allies are. And you'll have to decide whether you'd rather lead people who share your values or command people who only follow your orders. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving fast through the night. Marcus was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his weapon as he positioned himself between Eleanor and the door. "Stay back," he said quietly, blowing out the lamp to avoid silhouetting them against the window. The riders stopped just outside, and Marcus heard David's voice calling his name. "Marcus! Are you in there? We need to talk now." Marcus opened the door cautiously, keeping his body blocking Eleanor from view. David sat his horse in the yard, but he wasn't alone. 5 other warriors flanked him, all armed, all tense. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked. "Black Horse is gone," David said. "He took 8 men with him. They're planning to hit that settlement tonight, with or without your permission." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. "When did they leave?" 2 hours ago. "They'll reach the settlement just before dawn, perfect timing for a surprise attack." The tactical part of Marcus's mind immediately began calculating distances, routes, timing. If he left now, rode hard, he might be able to intercept Black Horse's group before they reached their target. But it would mean a confrontation with his own men, potentially a fight that could destroy what remained of his band's unity. "What do you want to do?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Marcus looked back at Eleanor, who had risen from her chair despite his instructions to stay back. Her face was pale but determined, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Go," she said. "Do what you know is right." He wanted to tell her he would be back, wanted to promise that everything would work out, wanted to say all the things that people said before riding into uncertain situations. Instead, he simply nodded and turned back to David. "We ride now, hard as we can manage." "All of us?" David asked, glancing at the other warriors. Marcus looked at each man in turn, warriors who had followed him for years, who had trusted his leadership through countless battles and raids. Tonight, they would find out whether that trust extended to following him away from a fight instead of into one. "Anyone who wants to come," Marcus said. "But understand, we're not riding to join Black Horse. We're riding to stop him." The silence stretched long enough that Marcus began to wonder if he would be riding alone. Then Samuel Redwing, a veteran warrior who had served with Marcus since the beginning, spoke up. "Those families have children," he said quietly. "Little ones who never harmed any of us. If we let this happen, we're no better than the soldiers who killed our own families." One by one, the other warriors nodded their agreement. Whatever doubts they might have about Marcus's recent changes in leadership, they weren't prepared to let innocent children pay the price for their grievances. "Then we ride," Marcus said, swinging up onto Thunder's back. And we pray we're not too late." As they thundered away into the darkness, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation he had just had with Eleanor. She had asked what kind of leader he wanted to be, and now he was about to find out. Tonight would either mark the beginning of a new path or the end of everything he had built over the past 12 years. The irony wasn't lost on him. For the first time in his life, Marcus Ironheart was riding into battle not to destroy, but to protect. Not to prove his strength, but to demonstrate his humanity. It felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The race through the December night was brutal. The ground was frozen hard as stone, treacherous with patches of ice that could lame a horse or break a rider's neck. But Marcus pushed the pace relentlessly, knowing that every minute of delay meant innocent people moved closer to danger. As they rode, he found himself thinking about the children who might be sleeping peacefully in that settlement, unaware that death was approaching in the form of men who had once been protectors of children themselves. He thought about how his sister Little Moon would have felt about what Black Horse was planning, how his father would have viewed the choice Marcus was making. For the first time in 12 years, he was riding toward a fight that felt completely right. The settlement came into view just as the eastern sky began to show the first faint traces of dawn. Smoke was already rising from the chimneys as early rising families began their daily routines. Unaware of the danger approaching from the north, Marcus could see Black Horse's group positioned on a ridge overlooking the settlement, preparing for their attack. In a few more minutes, they would sweep down on the cabins like wolves on a flock of sheep. There, David pointed to a narrow ravine that would allow them to approach Black Horse's position without being seen. "We can cut them off before they reach the settlement." Marcus nodded, then turned to address his men one final time before they committed to a course of action that would change everything. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying easily to each warrior despite the pre-dawn quiet. "What we do in the next few minutes will define who we are. Not who we've been, not who others expect us to be, but who we choose to become. Follow me now, and follow me toward something better than revenge." The attack they launched was unlike any Marcus had ever led. Instead of striking to kill, they struck to disable. Instead of inspiring terror, they sought to minimize harm. When the brief, fierce confrontation was over, Black Horse and his followers were captured rather than slaughtered. The settlement was safe, and Marcus Ironheart had crossed a line from which there would be no return. As the sun rose fully over the Dakota plains, Marcus looked down at the peaceful settlement below and felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years. He felt proud of who he was becoming. The aftermath of preventing Black Horse's raid created fractures in Marcus's band that could not be easily mended. Of the 23 warriors who had followed him for years, 8 had left with Black Horse. 6 more departed in the days following the confrontation, and only 9 remained loyal to Marcus's new direction. The mathematics of leadership were brutally simple. He had lost more than half his force in a single decision. But something unexpected happened in the weeks that followed. Word of what Marcus had done, how the feared Marcus Ironheart had ridden to protect Settler children rather than slaughter them, spread throughout the territory like wildfire. The story grew with each telling, as frontier stories always did. But the core remained consistent. The giant warrior had chosen mercy over vengeance. The first consequence was a delegation from the settlement he had saved. They arrived at his winter camp 3 days after New Year's Day, 1888. 5 men on horseback, led by a gray-bearded patriarch named Jonathan Mitchell, who served as the settlement's unofficial leader. Marcus's remaining warriors tensed as the riders approached, hands moving instinctively to weapons, but Marcus raised a hand for calm. "Mr. Ironheart," Mitchell called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying a mixture of nervousness and determination. "We've come to speak with you, if you're willing." Marcus studied the delegation carefully. These were farmers and shopkeepers, men more comfortable with plows than pistols. Yet they had ridden into the heart of Lakota territory to seek him out. That took either desperation or considerable courage. "Speak," Marcus said simply. Mitchell removed his hat, a gesture of respect that surprised the watching warriors. "We wanted to thank you for what you did. Our children are alive because of your intervention, and we ... We wanted you to know that not all of us paint all of your people with the same brush." The admission hung in the cold January air like visible breath. Marcus had expected many reactions to his actions, but gratitude from the people he was supposed to be terrorizing hadn't been one of them. "We also wanted to make you a proposition," Mitchell continued, his words coming faster as he gained confidence. "We know the winter's been hard on everyone. We have surplus grain from a good harvest, medical supplies, blankets. We're prepared to trade fairly for furs, beadwork, anything your people can spare. No cheating, no tricks, just honest commerce. Between neighbors." David Strongwolf stepped forward, his face skeptical. "And what do you want in return? Besides trade goods?" Mitchell looked uncomfortable but pressed on. "Safe passage for our families when they travel the main roads. Assurance that our children can play outside without fear. A chance to build something lasting instead of just waiting for the next attack." It was Marcus who answered. "You're asking me to control other bands, other warriors who don't follow my lead." "No," Mitchell said carefully. "We're asking you to set an example, to show that there's another way to resolve our differences. Your reputation carries weight throughout this territory. If Marcus Ironheart says there's a better path than endless raiding and retaliation, people will listen." The weight of that expectation settled on Marcus's shoulders like a physical burden. These men were asking him to become something he had never been, not just a warrior leader, but a peace chief, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. "I'll consider your offer," Marcus said finally. "Send a word in 1 week, and I'll give you my answer." After the delegation departed, Marcus's remaining warriors gathered around their leader with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright concern. "Are we seriously considering becoming traitors?" asked Samuel Redwing, voicing what several others were thinking. "We're considering survival," Marcus replied. "Look around you. 9 men. That's what's left of our band. We can continue the old ways and watch our numbers dwindle until we're nothing but a memory. Or we can adapt to changing times. The old ways worked for our fathers and their fathers before them," protested Michael Stormcloud, one of the younger warriors. "The old ways worked when we had the numbers and territory to support them," Marcus countered. "But the world has changed around us. We can change with it or be swept away by it." That evening, alone in his lodge, Marcus wrestled with the magnitude of what Mitchell had proposed. Becoming a peace chief would mean abandoning everything he had built his identity around for over a decade. It would mean admitting that the path of vengeance had led nowhere but to isolation and diminishing returns, but it would also mean honoring the memory of his father in a way that years of raiding never could. The next morning brought another unexpected visitor. Captain William Harrison. Marcus saw the blue cavalry uniform from half a mile away and felt the familiar surge of rage that Harrison's presence always triggered. This was the man responsible for his family's death, the architect of the massacre that had shaped Marcus's entire adult life. Every instinct screamed for him to attack, to finally claim the vengeance he had pursued for so long. Instead, he ordered his warriors to remain in camp and rode out alone to meet his enemy. Harrison waited in a small clearing beside the frozen creek, sitting his horse with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. He was older now, his hair gone gray, and his face marked by years of frontier service, but his eyes still held the same cold calculation that Marcus remembered from that terrible night in 1872. "Marcus Ironheart," Harrison said as Marcus approached. "Or should I call you by your given name? I've heard interesting stories about you lately." "Say what you came to say," Marcus replied. His voice leveled despite the fury building in his chest. Harrison smiled, a thin expression devoid of warmth. Direct as always. Very well. I'm here because certain parties are concerned about your recent evolution. A peaceful Marcus Ironheart is potentially more dangerous than a violent one. From a strategic standpoint. Explain. Simple mathematics. As long as you were just another raider, you were a problem we could contain through superior firepower and numbers. But a Marcus Ironheart who protects settlers instead of terrorizing them. Who trades instead of raiding? Who offers an alternative to the cycle of violence that has served our purposes so well? Harrison shook his head. That presents complications. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Your purposes? Harrison's smile widened. Oh, did you think this was all random? That the cycle of raid and retaliation, the steady escalation of violence, the growing hatred between your people and mine, did you imagine it all just happened naturally? The pieces began falling into place in Marcus's mind with sickening clarity. The timing of certain attacks, the convenient intelligence that had led to so many successful raids, the way conflicts always seem to escalate just when peaceful solutions might have been possible. You've been orchestrating this, Marcus said. His voice barely above a whisper. All of it. Orchestrating is too strong a word. Facilitating might be more accurate. You see, conflict is profitable, Marcus. It justifies military budgets, creates demand for weapons and supplies, opens up territory for development that would otherwise be tied up in lengthy negotiations. Peace, on the other hand, is expensive and complicated. Harrison dismounted, his movements unhurried and confident. Your personal vendetta against me has been particularly useful. It gave you credibility with other warriors, made you a symbol of resistance that we could point to whenever we needed to justify harsh measures against your people. Marcus felt the world tilting around him. Everything he had believed about his mission, his purpose, his righteousness, all of it had been manipulated, used as a tool by the very man he had sworn to destroy. Why tell me this? Marcus asked. Because I want you to understand the choice you're facing, Harrison replied. You can continue down this new path you've chosen, this fantasy of peace and cooperation, and I'll make sure it fails. Every trade agreement will be sabotaged. Every peaceful gesture will be met with violence from other bands that I'll ensure are well-armed and motivated. I'll turn you into a symbol of naive weakness instead of noble resistance. Harrison remounted his horse, looking down at Marcus with something that might have been pity. Or you can return to being the Marcus Ironheart who served my purposes so well. Continue the cycle of violence that has made both our reputations, and I'll ensure you have worthy enemies to fight and meaningful victories to celebrate. And if I refuse both options, Harrison's expression hardened, then you become a problem that needs to be eliminated. And unlike all those other times we've fought, this time I'll make sure the job gets finished properly. With that, Harrison wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving Marcus alone in the clearing, with the ruins of everything he had believed about himself and his mission. The ride back to camp was a blur of conflicting emotions, rage at being manipulated, shame at his own blindness, grief for all the years wasted pursuing a vengeance that had only served his enemy's goals. But underneath it all, a new determination was forming, not the hot fury that had driven him for so long, but something colder and more calculating. Harrison had revealed his hand too early. He had given Marcus information that could be used against him, shown him the true scope of the conspiracy that had shaped the territory's conflicts. More importantly, he had made it clear that the path toward peace was not just possible, but genuinely threatening to those who profited from war. That night, Marcus called his warriors together and told them everything Harrison had revealed. He watched their faces as they processed the implications, that their years of fighting had been guided by their enemies, that their greatest victories had served their oppressors' purposes, that their leader had been as blind as any of them to the larger game being played. So what do we do now? David asked when Marcus finished his account. We do exactly what Harrison doesn't want us to do, Marcus replied. We prove that peace is possible, that the cycle can be broken, that his whole system of profitable conflict can be dismantled. How? Marcus looked around the circle of faces, these men who had followed him through years of war and were now being asked to follow him towards something entirely different. We accept Mitchell's offer. We become traders instead of raiders. We protect settlements instead of attacking them. We build alliances instead of creating enemies. And we do it all so visibly, so successfully, that other bands will see there's a better way forward. Samuel Redwing frowned. That sounds like surrender. No, Marcus said firmly. Surrender would be giving Harrison what he wants. This is revolution, not the kind fought with weapons, but the kind fought with ideas. We're going to prove that his entire philosophy is wrong. The plan they developed over the next several days was ambitious almost to the point of fantasy. Marcus would use his reputation and connections to create a network of peaceful bands, willing to engage in trade rather than warfare. They would establish regular markets where Indian and white families could meet safely to exchange goods. They would create a system of communication that could prevent misunderstandings from escalating into violence. Most importantly, they would demonstrate that prosperity and security could be achieved through cooperation rather than conflict. Eleanor, when Marcus explained the plan to her during one of his visits, listened with the careful attention she gave to all his ideas before offering her perspective. It's a worthy goal, she said as they sat by her fireplace on a snowy February evening, but you're essentially trying to undo years of hatred and mistrust with a handful of men and good intentions. You think it's impossible? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I think it's the hardest thing you could possibly attempt. But I also think you're one of the few people in this territory with the reputation and skills to make it work. The reputation of a killer and a raider. The reputation of a man who keeps his word, who commands respect even from his enemies, who can project strength when necessary, but choose mercy when possible. Those qualities matter more than you might think. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture that had become familiar but never lost its power to surprise him. But Marcus, you need to understand, if you succeed at this, you'll make enemies of some very powerful people. Harrison won't be the only one who prefers the current system of controlled conflict. There are fortunes being made from military contracts, land speculation, and resource extraction that depends on keeping this territory unstable. Are you trying to talk me out of it? Eleanor smiled. I'm trying to make sure you go into this with your eyes open. Peace is harder to build than war is to start, and it requires more courage to maintain than most people possess. She paused, looking into the fire as if gathering her thoughts. But if anyone can do it, you can, and if you succeed, you'll have given your people something more valuable than any military victory ever could. What's that? A future. The first test of their new approach came sooner than Marcus had expected. 2 weeks after his conversation with Harrison, a young Crow warrior named James Bigheart arrived at their camp carrying disturbing news. There's a war party forming, he reported, accepting the traditional hospitality of food and shelter despite the historical enmity between Lakota and Crow bands. 50 warriors from 3 different tribes, led by a man called Iron Wolf. They're planning a major raid on the territorial capital banks, government buildings, civilian targets. It would be the largest coordinated attack in 20 years. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. An attack of that magnitude would bring massive military retaliation, potentially ending any hope of peaceful coexistence for generations. When? David asked. Spring thaw. Maybe 6 weeks. Iron Wolf is using your change in direction to recruit warriors, saying that if Marcus Ironheart has gone soft, someone needs to take up the fight. Marcus absorbed this information in silence. Everything he was trying to build could be destroyed by Iron Wolf's raid, not because of its immediate effects, but because of the response it would provoke. Harrison and his allies would have the justification they needed to crush any peaceful alternatives permanently. There's more, James continued reluctantly. Iron Wolf has sent word that any band that doesn't join his war party will be considered collaborators with the whites. He's promised that after he deals with the territorial government, he'll come for the traitors who refuse to support the cause. David looked at Marcus with grim understanding. They weren't just facing a choice between peace and war. They were facing a choice between resistance and extinction. "What's Iron Wolf's reputation?" Marcus asked. "Brutal but effective. He's never lost a major engagement, and his warriors follow him absolutely. He's also completely convinced that total war is the only path forward, no compromise, no negotiation, no mercy for anyone who gets in his way." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as he considered their options. He could try to convince Iron Wolf to abandon his plan, but that would require revealing the intelligence about Harrison's manipulation, information that might not be believed and could make Marcus look like he was making excuses for his new direction. He could report Iron Wolf's plans to the authorities, but that would make him an informant and destroy any credibility he had with other tribal leaders. Or he could do something that had never been attempted before in the history of the territory: assemble his own coalition to stop Iron Wolf, not through military force, but through political pressure and economic incentives. "James," Marcus said finally, "would you be willing to carry a message for me?" "Depends on the message. I want to call a gathering. Every band leader in the territory, both friendly and hostile. I want to propose an alternative to Iron Wolf's war that gives our people everything they really want: security, prosperity, autonomy, without the massive bloodshed that his plan would inevitably bring." James stared at him in disbelief. "You want to convene a council with Iron Wolf? He'll kill you the moment you show your face." "Maybe. But if I can convince even half the bands that there's a better way forward, Iron Wolf's coalition will collapse. And if I can single quotes double quotes," Marcus shrugged, "then at least I'll have tried to save our people from a war that will destroy them." The plan that emerged from that conversation would either mark the beginning of a new era of peace in the Dakota territory or result in Marcus's death and the complete destruction of everything he was trying to build. But as he rode toward Eleanor's cabin that night to tell her about his decision, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope for the future. Eleanor received the news of Marcus's plan with characteristic calm, though he could see the worry in her eyes as he explained what the gathering might mean. "You're gambling everything on the chance that you can outtalk a man whose entire identity is built around violence," she said, pouring coffee with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the gravity of what they were discussing. "I'm gambling everything on the chance that most people prefer prosperity to poverty, safety to fear, and building to destroying," Marcus replied. "Iron Wolf may be convinced that war is the only answer, but the warriors he's trying to recruit have families to feed and futures to consider." Eleanor settled into her chair, studying his face in the lamplight. "And if you're wrong? If they choose Iron Wolf's path over yours?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "Then I'll have failed, and our people will fight a war they can't win against an enemy that's been preparing for them to do exactly that. But if I don't try, the outcome is the same." "There's a third option," Eleanor said gently. "You could take your remaining men and leave. Head north to Canada or west to the mountains. Find somewhere far from all of this and start over. Run away. Survive. There's no shame in recognizing when a fight is unwinnable." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, marveling as always at how small it seemed in his grasp. "My father once told me that the most important battles are fought not for victory, but for the right to live with yourself afterward. If I run now, I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I abandoned my people when they needed leadership most. Eleanor squeezed his fingers gently. And if you stay and fail, then at least I'll know I tried to offer them something better than endless war. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Marcus tensed, his free hand moving instinctively toward his weapon, but Eleanor remained calm. "That'll be the Morrison boy," she said. "He comes by every few days to check on me since his father's accident. Sweet child, but he worries too much about an old widow living alone." Sure enough, young Jimmy Morrison's voice called out from the yard. "Mrs. Whitman? Are you all right in there? I saw smoke from your chimney, but no light in the windows." Eleanor rose to open the door, revealing the teenager standing beside his horse with a concerned expression that quickly shifted to surprise when he saw Marcus sitting at the table. "Oh, Mr. Ironheart, sir. I didn't know you were here. I just wanted to make sure Mrs. Whitman was safe." The boy's nervousness was obvious, but it was mixed with genuine respect rather than the terror that Marcus's presence usually inspired. Word of his role in saving Robert Morrison had clearly spread through the local community. "Your concern for Mrs. Whitman is commendable," Marcus said, rising to his full height but keeping his voice gentle. "How is your father recovering?" "Much better, sir. The arm's healing straight, and he says the ribs barely hurt anymore. Ma says it's a miracle, but Pa says it's just good doctoring and the fact that you were there to lift that tree." Jimmy paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, is it true what folks are saying? That you're trying to organize some kind of peace meeting?" Marcus glanced at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. "It's true. I'm hoping to convince the tribal leaders that there's a better path forward than the war that some are planning. My pa says if anyone can do it, it's you. He says you're the only man in the territory that both sides respect enough to listen to." The faith in the boy's voice was humbling. Here was someone who had grown up hearing stories about the terrible Marcus Ironheart, yet when he looked at the giant warrior, he saw hope rather than threat. "I'll do my best," Marcus said simply. After Jimmy departed, Eleanor and Marcus returned to their conversation, but the interruption had shifted something in the atmosphere. The boy's visit had reminded them both that the stakes of Marcus's gamble extended far beyond tribal politics or personal reputation. Families like the Morrisons were counting on him to find a way forward that didn't involve their children growing up in a war zone. "When will you send out the invitations for this gathering?" Eleanor asked. "Tomorrow. James Bigheart has agreed to carry messages to the major band leaders. If even half of them agree to attend, we'll have enough voices to challenge Iron Wolf's narrative." "And where will you hold it?" "Somewhere neutral, I assume." Marcus nodded. "Devil's Tower. It's sacred ground to most of our tribes, and isolated enough that we won't be interrupted by unwanted observers. Plus, it's a place where violence is traditionally forbidden, so even Iron Wolf would have to respect that." Eleanor was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if she could see the future in the dancing flames. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Marcus pay close attention. "Marcus, I need to tell you something about why I really moved out here, why I chose to stay after William died." He waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal was important. William wasn't just a farmer. He was a government surveyor, sent to map this territory for future development. The official story was that he died of consumption, but the truth is more complicated. Eleanor's hands tightened around her coffee cup. He discovered something in his surveys, evidence that certain military contractors were falsifying reports about mineral deposits and land values. They were manipulating the government into believing this territory was more valuable than it actually was, inflating the budgets for military protection and development. Marcus felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The same people who profit from keeping the conflicts going. Exactly. When William tried to report what he'd found, he was warned to keep quiet. When he refused, he started getting sick. The consumption was real, but I've always suspected it was helped along by something in his food or drink. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. You stayed here because you're continuing his work. Eleanor met his eyes directly. I've been documenting everything, the military movements, the contractor activities, the suspicious timing of various conflicts. I've been waiting for someone with enough influence to help me expose the whole conspiracy. And now you think that someone is me. I think you're about to call together the most influential tribal leaders in the territory for the first time. In living memory. If you can convince them to work together for peace, you'll have created something unprecedented, a unified voice that the government will have to take seriously. Eleanor rose and moved to a trunk beside her bed, returning with a thick folder of papers. These are William's original survey reports, along with my own observations over the past 3 years. Evidence of the manipulation, the false valuations, the coordinated efforts to maintain instability. Marcus opened the folder and began reading. What he found there was even worse than he had suspected. The conspiracy wasn't just about profiting from conflict, it was about creating a justification for seizing the entire territory through a manufactured crisis that would give the government an excuse to void all existing treaties and claims. Iron. Wolf's planned attack would provide exactly the pretext they needed. Why haven't you taken this to the authorities before now? Marcus asked. Eleanor's smile was bitter. Because the authorities are part of the conspiracy. The territorial governor, the military commanders, even some of the federal officials, they're all either directly involved or willfully ignorant because the current system serves their interests. So what do you suggest? Use the gathering to do more than just prevent Iron Wolf's war. Use it to expose the truth about who really benefits from the violence. Show the tribal leaders that they're being manipulated just as much as you were, and give them a reason to unite, not just for peace, but for justice. The next morning, Marcus began the most important diplomatic mission of his life. James Bigheart carried messages to band leaders throughout the territory, each one carefully crafted to appeal to specific concerns and interests, while emphasizing the urgency of the situation. To Red Cloud of the Oglala, the path of endless war leads only to the extinction of our people. Come here an alternative that preserves our strength while securing our future. To Spotted Tail of the Brule, the time has come to unite our voices in wisdom rather than scatter our strength in meaningless battles. Your counsel is needed to guide our people toward survival. To the American Horse of the Pine Ridge Band, Iron Wolf's war will bring catastrophe upon all our children. Help me offer them something better than the legacy of perpetual conflict. Each message was accompanied by sacred tobacco and a promise of safe passage, traditional diplomatic protocols that even the most hostile leaders would find difficult to ignore. The responses began arriving within days, carried by trusted messengers who had ridden hard across frozen plains to deliver their chief's words. Some were cautiously positive, others openly skeptical, but all agreed to attend the gathering. Even Iron Wolf himself sent word that he would come, though his message carried an unmistakable threat. I will hear what the former warrior has to say, but know that words will not turn me from the path of righteous war. As the date of the gathering approached, Marcus found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt since childhood: genuine nervousness. He had faced cavalry charges, fought against impossible odds, stared death in the face countless times without flinching. But the prospect of standing before the assembled leaders of his people and asking them to abandon everything they thought they knew about survival and resistance filled him with a terror that no physical threat had ever matched. Eleanor noticed his anxiety during one of his visits, just 3 days before he was scheduled to depart for Devil's Tower. "You're scared," she observed, not making it a question. "Terrified," Marcus admitted. "I've built my entire adult identity around being strong, decisive, and unshakable. But what I'm about to attempt requires me to be vulnerable, to admit that I've been wrong about fundamental things, to ask for trust from people who have every reason to doubt me." "Good," Eleanor said, surprising him. "Good? Fear means you understand the stakes. It means you're taking this seriously, instead of just relying on your reputation or your strength. The best leaders I've known were the ones who were afraid of making the wrong choice." She moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape where spring was just beginning to show its first tentative signs. "Marcus, do you remember what you told me about your sister? How could she believe that anything could be healed if you just cared enough?" "I remember. I think she was right. Not about everything. Some wounds are too deep, some damage too extensive. But I think she was right about the principle. Care enough, try hard enough, and sometimes you can fix things that everyone else thinks are beyond repair." Eleanor turned back to face him, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're about to try to heal something that's been broken for generations. The hatred between your people and mine, the cycle of violence that's consumed so many lives, the system of lies that keeps us all trapped in patterns that serve no one but the powerful. And if I fail, then you fail. But you'll fail while trying to do something magnificent, something that honors the memory of everyone you've lost and everyone you're trying to save." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of David Strongwolf, riding hard from their winter camp with urgent news. "Marcus," he called out before he had even dismounted. "We have a problem. Iron Wolf isn't waiting for the gathering. He's moved up his timeline. The war party is assembling now, planning to strike before the meeting can take place." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "How long do we have?" 2 days, maybe 3. He's got 47 warriors already committed, and more arriving every few hours. If he moves before the gathering, you'll never get the chance to present your alternative. Where is he assembling? Crow Creek, about 20 miles south of Devil's Tower. Close enough to your gathering site that he can strike there too, if he decides you're a threat that needs eliminating." Marcus paced the small confines of Eleanor's cabin, his mind racing through options and possibilities. Everything depended on the gathering. Without it, Iron Wolf would launch his war unopposed, and all hope of peaceful resolution would die. In the bloodshed that followed, "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, reading the determination that was building in his expression. "I'm thinking that sometimes you have to risk everything to save anything," Marcus replied. "David, send word to every leader who agreed to attend the gathering. Tell him the meeting is moved up tomorrow at dawn. Devil's Tower. Tell them it's urgent, that the future of all our people depends on their presence. And Iron Wolf?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering options that ranged from diplomatic to suicidal. Finally, he made a decision that would either save everything or destroy it completely. "I'm going to Crow Creek, tonight, alone." David stared at him in shock. "That's suicide. You ride into Iron Wolf's camp by yourself, you'll never ride out again." "Maybe, but I have something he doesn't expect, the truth about who's really been manipulating this conflict. If I can convince him that his war serves our enemy's purposes better than our own, maybe I can turn him into an ally instead of an ally." "Obstacle." Eleanor stepped forward, placing herself directly in front of Marcus. "And if you can't convince him?" Marcus looked down at this small woman who had already given him so much companionship, wisdom, hope for a different kind of future. He wanted to promise her that everything would work out, that he would return safely, and they would build the peaceful life he was beginning to dare imagine. Instead, he told her the truth. "Then tomorrow's gathering will be my memorial service, instead of a peace conference. But either way, our people will hear the truth about what they're really fighting for and who really benefits from their suffering." The plan that crystallized in the final hours before his departure was audacious to the point of madness. Marcus would ride alone into Iron Wolf's camp, carrying Eleanor's evidence of the conspiracy along with a proposal that would require iron Wolf to abandon everything he had, planned in favor of something completely unprecedented. Success would mean uniting the territory's tribal leaders in a way that had never been achieved before. Failure would mean certain death and the continuation of a cycle of violence that would eventually consume everyone he cared about. As Marcus prepared to leave Eleanor's cabin for what might be the last time, she stopped him at the door with a gesture that summarized everything he had learned about the difference between strength and power. She reached up, took his face in her small hands, and kissed him gently on the forehead, not with passion, but with the kind of blessing that mothers give to children embarking on dangerous journeys. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Come back and we'll build something beautiful together." It was the first time either of them had acknowledged the love that had been growing between them, and it gave Marcus something he had never had before when riding into danger, a reason to survive that had nothing to do with vengeance or duty or reputation. As he rode through the frozen night toward what would either be his greatest triumph or his final battle, Marcus Ironheart carried with him the revolutionary idea that love might be stronger than fear, that hope might be more powerful than hatred, and that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is choose peace over war. Behind him, Eleanor stood in her doorway, watching until his massive silhouette disappeared into the darkness, then went inside to prepare for whatever tomorrow might bring, the beginning of a new world, or the end of the one man who had made her believe that broken things could still be healed. The war camp at Crow Creek burned like a constellation against the frozen earth, 47 fires marking the positions of warriors who had come to follow Iron Wolf into what they believed would be a glorious battle. Marcus approached on foot, leaving Thunder tied a mile away, carrying nothing but Eleanor's documents and the sacred pipe that marked him as coming under a flag of truce. Iron Wolf received him in the center of the camp, surrounded by his war chiefs and the crackling energy of men preparing for violence. He was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of a man who had never known anything but war. His eyes held the same cold certainty that Marcus recognized from his own mirror in earlier years. "Marcus Ironheart," Iron Wolf said, his voice carrying across the silent camp. "The great warrior who now protects the children of his enemies. You have courage coming here." "I have information," Marcus replied, pulling the folder from his coat. "Information that changes everything we think we know about this conflict." What followed was the most important conversation of Marcus's life. Standing in the firelight before men who could kill him with a word from their leader, he laid out the evidence of the conspiracy, the falsified surveys, the manufactured conflicts, the systematic manipulation that had turned both sides into pawns in a larger game. Iron Wolf listened with growing anger, but not at Marcus. As the scope of the deception became clear, his fury turned toward the real architects of their suffering. "You're saying we've been dancing to their tune all along," Iron Wolf said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm saying they've been playing us against each other while they profit from our blood. Your war will give them exactly the excuse they need to seize everything and destroy what's left of our people." The silence that followed stretched until Marcus thought his heart might stop. Then Iron Wolf did something unprecedented. He laughed, a sound with no humor in it but terrible understanding. "So what do you propose instead, Peace Chief?" Marcus outlined his plan, not just the gathering at Devil's Tower, but the larger vision of tribal unity, economic cooperation, and political leverage that could expose the conspiracy while building genuine security for their people. It was ambitious beyond anything ever attempted, requiring trust between hereditary enemies and coordination across dozens of independent bands. Iron Wolf studied the documents by firelight, his war chiefs reading over his shoulder. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed completely. "If this is true, if we can prove this conspiracy, then our real enemy isn't the settlers or even the army. It's the system that's been using all of us. Will you join the gathering? Will you stand with us instead of against us?" Iron Wolf was quiet for a long moment, looking around at the faces of his warriors. Then he did something that would be remembered in tribal stories for generations. He walked to his war fire and kicked dirt over the flames, symbolically ending the war party before it could begin. "We ride to Devil's Tower," he announced to his followers, "not for war, but for truth." The gathering that took place the next dawn was unlike anything in the territory's history. 37 band leaders representing every major tribe in the region sat in a great circle beneath the sacred tower, listening as Marcus and Iron Wolf presented their evidence to representatives of peoples who had been enemies for generations. Documents Eleanor had preserved proved devastating to the conspiracy. Survey reports showing deliberate misinformation, correspondence detailing plans to provoke conflicts, financial records revealing who profited from military contracts. All of it painted a picture of systematic manipulation that had cost countless lives while enriching a small group of powerful men. But it was Iron Wolf who provided the most compelling argument for unity. "They have made us into weapons pointed at each other's hearts," he declared to the assembled leaders. "While we bled for scraps of territory, they carved up entire regions for their own profit. While we fought over hunting grounds, they stole mineral rights worth more than any of us imagined." The debate that followed was fierce but civil, conducted according to ancient protocols that required respect even in disagreement. Some leaders remained skeptical, others demanded more proof, but none could deny the fundamental logic of what they were hearing. As the sun reached its zenith, Red Cloud of the Oglala stood to address the gathering. His words would tip the balance one way or another. "I have fought the white soldiers for 20 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I have seen my people suffer and die for causes I believed were just. But if Marcus Ironheart and Iron Wolf speak truth, if we have been manipulated into destroying ourselves for other men's profit, then the greatest victory we can achieve is to stop dancing to their war drums." One by one, the leaders stood to pledge their support for the new alliance. Not all of them, some remained committed to the old ways. Others feared the risks of such a dramatic change. But enough agreed to create something unprecedented, a unified tribal confederation with the political weight to demand justice and the economic power to build a sustainable future. 3 months later, the conspiracy was exposed in congressional hearings that rocked Washington. Captain Harrison and his collaborators were arrested, their scheme unraveled by the very people they had manipulated. The territorial government was reorganized under federal oversight, with new policies that recognized tribal sovereignty while creating frameworks for peaceful coexistence. Marcus found himself appointed as the first Native American territorial representative, a position that required him to divide his time between political responsibilities and the life he was building. With Eleanor, they married in a simple ceremony by Willow Creek, attended by tribal leaders, settler families, and even some of the soldiers who had once feared the name Marcus Ironheart. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. There were still conflicts, still people on both sides who preferred the old ways of hatred and violence. But the cycle had been broken, the system of profitable warfare dismantled, and a new model of coexistence established. On their first wedding anniversary, as Marcus and Eleanor sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set over the prairie, she asked him if he ever missed the simplicity of his old life. "Simple." Marcus laughed, pulling her closer. "You call building a lasting peace between dozens of independent groups simple? You call learning to trust former enemies simple? You call creating something that's never existed before simple?" Eleanor smiled, resting her head against his massive shoulder. "I suppose not. But do you ever miss the certainty? When you knew exactly who your enemies were and what you needed to do about them." Marcus considered the question seriously. There had been a clarity to his old life that his new one lacked. The path of vengeance had been straightforward, if ultimately hollow. The path of peace required constant negotiation, compromise, and faith in outcomes he couldn't control. I miss the simplicity sometimes, he admitted. But I wouldn't trade the complexity for anything. This life building instead of destroying, healing instead of hurting, loving instead of hating. It's harder, but it's real in a way that violence never was. Eleanor reached up and took his hand. The same gesture she had made that first day in Thompson's trading post when everything changed. Your sister was right, you know, about things being healable if you care enough. Marcus squeezed her fingers gently, thinking about Little Moon's absolute faith in the possibility of mending broken things. She would have liked you. I would have liked her too. And I think she would be proud of what her big brother became. As darkness settled over the territory they had helped transform, Marcus Ironheart, former warrior, current peacemaker, and always Eleanor's husband, reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from vengeance to love, from isolation to connection, from being feared by all to being led home by the touch of one small, brave hand. The giant who had once terrorized the plains now spent his days building schools, mediating disputes, and proving that the strongest warriors are sometimes the ones who choose to put down their weapons and pick up the much harder work of creating something better than what they found. And in the cabin by Willow Creek, where it all began with an offer of coffee and kindness, love had indeed proven stronger than fear, hope more powerful than hatred, and the future brighter than anyone had dared to imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.